All right.
As okay, we're on. As we read it, do you? I mean, one of the things we talked about was to thematize the issue of my digital distance.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we want to add that right now. Maybe it need not be that long at the start.
Well, yeah, and I think maybe just something about saying something like, you could apologize for not being there in person, but then maybe say that it's maybe fitting that we do this with you digitally because our friendship started digitally.
Yeah. All right. Well, do you want to if you go right at the beginning, you go right into the discussion
Right.
of
Yeah.
Sherman.
Yeah.
I do think it's good for you to start because you're physically there.
Okay. So what if we break up? Oh, you know what? Let me get my Synergy running so I can use one keyboard. It'll just take a second. And over here,
Are you gonna be able to do two screens, one keyboard?
yeah. Okay.
All right. Are you editing it in the client or in the website?
Well, I'm editing it in Word, which
Yeah,
means
we have to sync it, I think.
mhm. um, I was editing something with my friend Andrew Lazella yesterday, and I realized that in the online version of Word, there's weirdnesses like they don't do curly quotes.
Yeah, no, it's bad.
So okay, then I'll just try to keep periodically saving it. Um, but what I'm thinking of is maybe breaking up. Breaking up the first part.
Yeah.
Like
So you could start with it's great. It's great to be invited to at the Clay game. It's a daunting task, but also great to work together again.
yeah,
Um,
and then maybe after the friendship.
yeah.
So then you could say, what would
Oh,
you like to say?
seeing that pretty live. I'm pretty much seeing that live.
Are you?
Yeah,
Nice.
very nice. Not nearly like what it used to be when we'd have to call each other up and send the document.
And then that one stupid program where only one of us could have the com.
Exactly. All right.
So why don't you write your own apology for not being there? But
Okay.
lead me into um, us being gathered together in our encounter with the text.
Okay. Um, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. I say something about why. I mean, what's going on, or constantly thinking about that. Now, let me hold on. I could just go into. I mean, we can tweak it. Um, uh, Yeah, well, I have to. I know my issue is when if I go into this. All right, let me just write that, and let's start, and I'll write that later.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, that's fine.
Um, um, I'll just say, but
Yeah, I think that's great.
um, uh, um, and now I'll just say, actually, given that you and I, Greg, developed our friendship more our friendship in I'll just say our friendship in graduate school more deeply only when you only after you left for a Fulbright I guess left on a Fulbright for in Poland, and we emailed regularly. It is somehow appropriate that our time that our work here is again mediated by a digital closeness. I don't know.
Okay.
Or something like that.
Yeah. So
and then, yeah. But yeah, okay, and I could even say digital encounter or something.
Right.
Because then we get into encounter.
Right. And then maybe you, I should change here to one. Gathers one and gathered us, if only digitally, together in an
All right,
encounter.
I'm not seeing. All right, you're doing something. So we'll see about the. I'm not seeing it actually happen.
Oh, okay.
But all right.
I just saved it.
In relation, I've been thinking that there's something about the day anima that sort of gathers you. That's all I have. You. Then.
Oh.
You just saved it.
Come on, get over there.
All right. Well, maybe I
clock.
did it. Oh, there we go. Okay, I had to save it. That's what it was. Okay. Okay.
So in relation to that, I've been thinking that there is something about De Anima that sort of gathers one and gathered us, if only digitally, together in an encounter with the text. But now I feel as though I'm channeling Reiner. You know, Reiner Sherman was one of the founders of the Collegium.
It's a little odd, given his philosophical suspicion of foundations, grounds, and principles. I can hear his voice now. That story of my being a founder in the Collegium is metaphysical and very boring. I miss him. His absence remains, for me at least, extremely present.
Yeah, I feel it too. Sometimes I even hear his voice in my head. It's interesting because in rereading the text, I've been struck by the passage we reference at the start of our paper, Remember when Aristotle speaks of the value of inquiring into the nature of the soul? He says something like, and it seems that familiarity, gnosis, of it contributes, symbolistai, greatly toward all truth, and especially to the truth concerning nature, for the soul is, in a certain sense, the principle of living things.
Now that you mention it, that passage contains some of the terms that were at the center of Sherman's thinking. Aletheia, physis, arte. For Sherman, though, these terms were crucial to another kind of gathering, one that's not so happy. Already in Heidegger on being and acting, but more so in Broken Hegemony, he was constantly concerned with the ways in which the positing of principles sets truth and physis into order in ways that establish and perpetuate systems of violence and injustice.
Right, and Sherman himself, following Heidegger, often identified Aristotle as the founder of metaphysics that imposed the principles of human fabrication on the processes of nature in order to account for them in terms of causes. Yet here at the beginning of the De Anima, Aristotle begins by not by positing a principle, but notice but by our familiarity with the soul. This familiarity or gnosis is, I think, itself perplexing because it opens an encounter with all truth, and then in particular, and I think most of all, with the truth concerning physis. I kind of wish we had written our paper on this sentence.
We certainly talked a lot about it as we worked on the paper. It seems as if Aristotle's here expressing something crucial about psyche, about soul as a principle of living things. He seems to be acknowledging that whatever we might want to call truth, aletheia, is encountered through what is called soul. Truth is not, as we might say, out there, but neither is it in here, in the soul. It seems to me that he's pointing to the soul as the site of the encounter with the world, or of an encounter with the world, the site from which or in which truth appears. An encounter is an uncovering and an opening.
Yeah, but that's not so easy to think through. There is a gnosis, a familiarity with regard to the soul that opens onto or contributes to, maybe even comes together with, truth of all kinds and the truth of physis. It seems like there's a kind of logical progression here that must end with the soul as most familiar, or else there is an infinite regress. What I mean is that this gnosis of the soul is precisely what brings about the gnosis of all truth, and particularly the truth concerning physis. If we are not now going to ask about what familiarity brings about familiarity of the soul must be that which is most familiar. Therefore, Aristotle raises the situation of the familiar soul encountering a world, aletheia, that then, in some sense, is seen as one's own.
So this text has, for us, a certain familiarity, not only because we hear Reiner's voice in it, but also because the soul is most familiar. So familiar, in fact, that it conditions our encounters with the world and with one another. It conditions our most intimate, self-reflective encounters with ourselves. This is probably why Aristotle says we should give primary place to the inquiry concerning the soul, and why he calls its objects better and more wonderful. Our familiarity with the soul at once enables us to encounter the world and hinders us from attaining the sort of objectivity philosophers and scientists have long coveted.
Yeah, but now I don't know whether to feel liberated from objectivity or trapped in an all-absorbing subjectivity. When Aristotle says that the familiarity with the soul brings an encounter with all truth, he seems to be suggesting just that kind of subjectivity. But then I think Reiner is right in the end, that is metaphysical and very boring. I'm still thinking that there is something about this claim of Aristotle that leads in different directions. If this familiarity, this gnosis, is an encounter, then truth does emerge in our familiarity with the soul, but that would have to mean that the truth is, to repeat, not either in the soul nor out there, but is this encounter, this familiar engagement, or else we're stuck within our own souls. The soul, therefore, must already be in the world and reaching out to it. But if this is the site of the truth, the encounter of aletheia, then the world is reaching back to the soul. And it must be that in this way, physis does not name something independent of the soul, The soul, I would say, is also physiological.
Yeah, it's funny that you should mention that. It reminds me of something I read in a book I stumbled upon in one of those small bookstores by the New School. It's a bound photocopy of a set of 4 lectures Frederick Woodbridge gave in 1930 at Union College. John Herman Randall edited it under the title Aristotle's Vision of Nature. And in that book, Woodbridge suggests that the key to Aristotle's psychology is the recognition that there is, as he says, a correlation between the powers of the soul and the natural conditions of their exercise. He points to that passage from the De Anima at 429a17 that says something like, the ability to perceive is to that which is perceived as the ability to think is that which is thought to that which is thought. And he takes this to mean that, quote, that for every power of the soul, there's an appropriate field of operation in nature, as he says. In this sense, we're always already at home in the world because the world already conforms to our capacities to encounter it.
This is probably why Aristotle constantly proceeds from what is most familiar, only then to move to what is unfamiliar on the basis of what is here in front of us. I like the notion of nature being appropriate to the soul and vice versa. In one sense, it marks a fittingness of each to the other. There is, of course, still the Schurmanian worry that the soul appropriates, that is, makes its own, what is actually radically non-identical to it. So familiarity read with appropriateness seems better suited.
Speaking of what's familiar, everyone here is familiar with the road Aristotle takes in physics. The natural quote. All right, so hold on. I'm going to pause here for a second because I think we. So, all right. So at this point, I actually think what the note that I wrote there about appropriation might be more. I'm not sure why I'm quoting this. I mean, other than to get the idea, the broader idea of familiarity.
Mm-hmm.
So well, let me see if I can flesh out here. I don't know if we write it, but what I was so the soul appropriates, makes its own. So I mean, we could flesh out the meaning of appropriation, what's proper at that point. And let's
yeah,
see,
and I think
your point, you go to I mean, I like that point about we wouldn't look at it if it weren't both familiar yet strange. But I think I could get there. I mean, do we need to reference the passage from the physics? Like I could make that point about appropriate.
Sorry, you broke up for a minute. But I would rather go along with your note and maybe rather than talk about the physics, talk about proper eignen, appropriation, because we come back to that often enough in what follows. And so if we could play on this appropriateness, then I bring it back to familiarity.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me see if I have this.
So I would rather do that.
Okay, hold on.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I want to see. I wanted to look in if I could find the text where I talk about that so that I can just I could, let's see. So yeah, so where I'm thinking of this is in Unterwegs zur Sprache, Heidegger talks about das eigene, and Krell has in his introduction to that in the English translation the notion that this is how Krell puts it, das eigene, whatever is a thing's own, that is, whatever shows itself when language lets a thing advene under its own power. So this idea of, all right, so I could say so familiarity read with appropriateness seems better suited, and I could say yes, especially if we take what is appropriate in as that which is most proper. What Heidegger called das eigene. Das eigene, comma, what is one's own.
Okay, but I think what we do need is what we get at the end after the quote, namely the familiarity and opacity, familiar and strangeness.
Right. So that, but, and that's, so I would say something like, yes. So, so especially if we take what is appropriate as that which is most proper, what Heidegger called das eigene, what is one's own, right? So even in that section, I'm looking at my Aristotle and the Nature of Truth book where I reference this, and I'd say there that what is proper to each individual, properly speaking, is somehow perceived, even if it remains recalcitrant to articulation. So the point being that there's this strength, there's this, even what's proper to something has something that escapes notice that is strange.
Right.
So
I mean, it seems to me that both in Latin, so this word proper and property is related to one's own, but I think in both English, Latin, and well, I guess also German, you would call something one's own in order to mark also a non-identity, right? So I don't have to claim that I'm my own, or so I am obviously myself, and so the claim about being proper and being one's own already marks a kind of differentiation.
Yeah. Well, do you want to, maybe you want to break in there and say that? Do you know what I mean? Like part of one of the things that I'm feeling like in this first part too is that even though we go back and forth, we don't have, we speak individually a bit each time.
Right.
You know, we don't have the back and forth, which is okay because we're trying to develop some things. I mean, I also am struck as we read it that we're gonna have to do this more, or we're gonna have to practice it more because
it needs to be more talky.
Yeah, it's got to be more talky. But the problem is, yeah, it just does. That's it.
Right.
I mean, except for we have to write the talkie.
Well, I tried to introduce more talky elements.
Yeah, you did. You did. No, it was good. And the issue is, I mean, and it happens in the transitions and stuff.
Yeah. So
Okay,
I don't know
so
if
you're gonna write this stuff about the languages.
Yeah, I don't know if you
No,
see
I
me
can
right.
see it. That's good. Yep.
Something like that.
Yeah. Even in Latin, proprium property is what's one's own and what is fitting. But does that already mark a difference? I claim something as being my own when it is other than me. Okay, then I could say,
So we need
then
this. We need.
We need that. This means then familiarity we have with the soul is also a reference to its opacity. Is that right?
Right, exactly.
Strange.
Would that just follow if you just said then?
Yeah. So I'll add that. But the thing is, but does that mean that? All right. So your point.
So I'm introducing a differentiation. So being one's own, being proper and appropriate, and all of those cognates doesn't mean identity, and therefore there may not be a complete transparency.
Right. Right. So I could say something like right. That which is one's own does not simply, I don't know if this is right, consolidate into or does not consolidate into a simple identity. A simple entity. So the familiarity we have with the soul, even if it is our own, right? How about the familiarity we have with our own souls brings with it a certain opacity, carries
Okay.
with it, or announces already a certain opacity. It is familiar and yet strange. All right, so that's what it said. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Right. That which is one's own does not consolidate into a simple identity. So the familiarity we have with, I think we said we have with our own souls,
Uh-huh.
announces already a certain opacity. It is familiar and yet strange.
Okay, so now I realize this yeah, yeah is an excited one, not a dismissive one. Not like,
Right.
yeah, but it's
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
you're
yeah.
right.
And
So
if it,
maybe I won't ham up the familiar yet strange so much. I'll just read that as a more like it's familiar and yet strange.
yeah, yeah. And if it weren't both, we'd never, yeah, see, that's where we need to be more talky, right? And
Right.
if it weren't both, we would never look into it. If it
Yeah.
weren't familiar,
So the
we
question
would
I
be
have
told,
there is, do you want to write it that way now?
well, let's keep going and um take time maybe before we meet again. I'll have more time to maybe write in the talky parts.
Okay. I mean, the thing that's interesting is that, if we think about this as something we publish too, right? We have this hybrid text here. We have
Right.
this text that is going to be the text of what we talk, but also I think there's something interesting, I think, about having it written in a talky way,
Yeah.
right? So that it's potentially more accessible, but it also captures the living speech of our living voices to some degree, although it's hard to capture. I mean, you can already feel, I mean, the conceit that I was noticing as we were reading, that the conceit that we're playing with is just going to palpably be a conceit, already for everybody, which is fine. I mean, I think that's good in a way, right?
Right.
Especially if we just don't, give up on it. We just keep going on it, and people are like, okay, yeah, obviously you wrote this paper, but this is, you know,
Yeah, I know. I think we keep leaning into it.
yeah, just right, just yeah, exactly.
All right, before we continue, let me grab some more water.
Okay, I'm grabbing coffee. All right, Mike, I gotta wait a second. My coffee will come up. But one thing that was Well, I was gonna say something about the um. Yeah, I wonder if we ought to also. I mean, I don't love losing that passage from the physics, but because that does reinforce the idea of what is familiar. It ties it methodologically into
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was just looking where it was. It ties it methodologically into Aristotle,
Well, we could refer to it without citing it.
right.
You could just mention
Yeah, maybe it's overwrought though if we do it that way.
okay.
All right, let me get my thing. Hold on. All right. The cats are getting hungry. They always start really bothering me right around now, so they want their food. All right. Did you finish?
Yeah. So, yeah. And if it weren't both, we wouldn't ever look into it. If it weren't familiar, we'd be totally oblivious. And if it were not opaque, if it weren't opaque, we would get the whole thing immediately at once. But then this has to also hold for truth, all truth, and especially the truth concerning phusis. So the soul is physiological in this complicated sense of familiarity and opacity.
Okay, but wait, did you notice how this strange familiarity we seem to have with the soul is said in the text from Aristotle to contribute greatly to all truth?
Yeah, and the verb Aristotle uses there, I think, is subjective, symbolistai. At the root is the idea of two things being thrown together. Don't you make a big deal of the way Aristotle uses the word symbolon in your book on Aristotle and truth? If I recall correctly, you cite Umberto Eco there, who seems to have captured something important about the meaning of symbol. He says something like two halves of the same thing, either one standing for the other, both becoming, however, fully effective only when they are matched to make up again the original whole.
Thanks, man, for recalling that. If we ever publish this paper, let's be sure to cite the text in the book. You know, we always need to help each other feed the citation index machine. Okay, so all right, well, maybe we'll leave that for now. I got issues with that already. I mean, anyway, there's a bigger story to tell about this citation thing that I'm working on in a different context. But all right, so by using symbolistai here, Aristotle seems to suggest that there's a symbolic connection between the familiarity we have with the soul and our access to truth. And Sherman would want, I imagine, to emphasize the manner in which this connection enjoins a kind of action. There are those two passages he published in the 1970s, one on symbolic difference and the other on symbolic praxis. And as we question Aristotle's language here, we do well to remember what Reiner says in the first essay. I think I have it here, so I gotta pull it out. Right? The question of language will then strive to retrace steps, going backwards along the course of a privileged speaking, that which establishes a new way of existing in the listener. Symbols do this. Maybe by questioning Aristotle's language, going backward along the course of privileged speaking, we'll discover new ways of existing. Perhaps we are here on the path of a kind of methodology of our paper. When we revise it, we should work that in.
Yeah, and to travel along that path with you a little bit further, let's remember that for Reiner, such new ways of existing emerge as practices of reading. If I remember, he says later in that essay something like, to read is to interpret is to exist in a new way. The hermeneutical relation concerns our reality, for the text interprets us.
The text interprets us. What if we allow this text, that sentence with which we begin our paper today, or with which we begin our paper? Do I want to say today or just begin our paper?
With which we will, let's say.
Okay, all right, that's good. With which we will begin our paper today, to interpret us through the performance of the paper itself. What if we took seriously what Sherman says in the second essay, the one on symbolic praxis, where he insists that, quote, the poetics of the symbol gives one something to do. Symbols create, he says. Notice how he speaks in the plural here. He emphasizes the importance of this when he goes on to say, poetics does not speak of the symbol, but of symbols in the plural. Can't you even now hear him saying this? Poetics does not speak in the symbol, but of symbols in the plural.
Yeah, I remember. There was never a universal concept that he didn't want to pluralize and make differing from itself in singulars.
But listen to what he says next. Quote, hence a poetics, the symbol, is not only impossible de jure, but furthermore,
the poetics of symbols would be a mad attempt de facto, for the symbolic given is inexhaustible. The method forgoes universal discourse. It agrees to be multiple and without conclusion.
Yeah, multiple and without conclusion. Do you think this crowd is going to be ready for a paper that's multiple without conclusion?
Do you think we're ready?
Probably not. But still, that passage is remarkable, and it suggests a kind of method for us. Actually, Sherman calls it glorious. You know, it was the 70s, and it wasn't long yet out of the monastery. But he says, its glory, that is the glory of this poetic method, shall be that it attaches itself to certain symbols and brings their creative power to light.
All right, but then let's return to the text and to the symbol of symbalein, because there's creative power in it.
Yeah, and it gestures to the throwing together of a certain familiarity with truth. But perhaps more deeply, the verb itself points to our own encounters with the soul. The symbol of this symbol seems to unsettle all our assumptions about the liberal subject, separate, independent, and free. It invites us to recognize ourselves as multiple.
Are you channeling Whitman now?
Why? Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I'm large. I contain multitudes.
You're not that big, my friend.
Well, I can always count on you to keep me grounded.
Okay, but now go back to that point about the liberal subject and this constellation of terms: familiarity, symbol, and truth.
The way these terms fall together in the sentence with which we begin the paper suggests at once that the soul may be the site for the happening of truth, and that this site is irreducibly multiple, such that every attempt to appeal to a stable subject on the basis of which to access an unequivocal truth is delusional.
What do you mean to suggest, though, by emphasizing that the terms of the sentence fall together?
Actually, I was thinking of Emma Bianchi's work, both in her book on the feminine symptoms in Aristotle and her essay on Sherman, natal bodies and mortal bodies. She wrote that essay for the symposium we held on Sherman's work at Penn State. Remember that?
Yeah, and as I recall, she was critical of Sherman for rejecting sexual difference as a category of philosophical analysis and his utter silence on matters of sexuality more generally.
Yeah, she did, and I never tired of laughing about the time when Sherman was on the panel with Drusilla Cornell and Jacques Derrida during our first year, my first year with her at the New School, when Sherman dismissed them both for talking about sexual difference. He called the distinction, yet again, metaphysical and very, very boring. Still, the multiplicity of the subject and the falling together of words, we find, I mean, actually, it might be good for you to say this. I was going to say after I do my very boring thing. But all right, I can come back to it. Still, the multiplicity of the subject and the falling together of words we find in this early sentence are connected to the embodied nature of human life. Emma emphasizes the significance of the symptom in Aristotle. She says that symptoma is literally a falling together, for sum is together and pipto is to fall. For anything that befalls one, a chance or a mischance or a calamity, as she says.
All right, let me just pause here. I think you're right. But what if we simply do this? What if I take the first part, still the multiplicity of the subject, that first sentence, and then
I come back with Emma?
Emma, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's good. That's good. Okay. I feel like this section is a little bit more bantery, so I think it's actually good in terms of keeping the listeners interested, I would think.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, but your own emphasis on the importance of attending to the way things are said in Aristotle, I think you call it the legomenological method, seems to tell against this notion that words of that sentence just fall together by chance.
It's not that they fall together by chance, but they're symptomatic in the sense Emma so beautifully traces in her book. Like Sherman, Emma emphasizes the plurality of principles, the multiple beginnings in Aristotle. For example, in talking about the nature of nature itself, physis, Aristotle, wait, I have her text here. So that would be good. That would be a way to bring in, to make it to make it good that I'm not physically there, because I'll just be like I'll just have those texts in front,
Right.
just off screen and pull them
Right.
out.
And it furthers the conceit a little bit too.
Exactly. Although we might have to play around with that one moment where you finished the quote from Sherman.
Yeah, I might say something like, maybe I could say something like, wait, I think I could quote it from memory.
Yeah, right. Okay, that'd be funny. Yeah, go back up there and change that. And then, yeah, do you see where that? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Okay, that's good. All right, and I do like that line of, do we think that this crowd is ready? And do you think we're ready? That's good. Okay. All right. So, wait. I have her text here. She writes, quote, alongside the plurality of principles is also the indeterminateness of matter. Matter's lack of determinacy or boundary, horos, as well as the multiplicity of beginnings or principles of motion appear as the symptoma of the cosmos, the chance occurrences falling together where they may, end quote. So the falling together of the words in our favorite sentence at the start of the De Anima are themselves symptomatic of the, let's call that the touchstone sentence now.
Okay.
How about that? All right. Our touchstone sentence at the start of the De Anima are themselves symptomatic of the peculiar multiplicity not only the beginning of the investigation into the soul, but of the soul itself in its embodied relation to the world.
So here the soul seems then to be something more like the site of our encounter with the world than it does a determined and bounded phenomenon.
Right. And Donna Haraway has suggested that, quote, bounded individualism in its many flavors in science, politics, and philosophy has finally become unavailable to think with, truly no longer thinkable technically or in any other way. So in many ways, Aristotle is the founder of bounded individualism, with its attempts to press for an understanding of primary ousia as separate and a this.
Right, but remember, we emphasized in our essay on nous and logos in Aristotle, already with the term for this, todati, there's a certain multiplicity. That too is a symptom, I suppose.
Yeah, a symptom that articulates with beautiful ambiguity the messiness of our embedded and embodied nature. Familiarity with this symptomatic multiplicity should indeed contribute greatly to all truth, and especially to the truth concerning nature. Right now, I have to break off here and get everybody their breakfast and stuff. But okay, well, that's a good stopping point now. So, yeah. So what do you think here? What's the next step?
I think I now have a better idea of how to continue where I was going at the end. Okay. And you remember a few meetings ago, we talked about, we raised this phrase, appropriate violence.
Yeah.
So I actually take that on.
Good.
And so I bring this living well. I talk about that in terms of appropriate, and then I point to a certain duality within appropriate that you find within arche, namely that something is appropriate if it's fitting, but I can also appropriate, that is, take something away from you, and that this is a risk in this encounter we have with one another, with the world. And then I want to say, I have a saying, yeah, but maybe that risk and that danger is unavoidable. So then what do we do in that the unavoidability of that risk? And which you might refer to simply as finitude.
Yeah, right.
But then I say, well, okay, now we already have this on the table. Maybe there's a way of owning, that is, appropriating the violence of one's own thetic moment, and therefore we get to this issue of appropriate violence.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, so why don't you play around with that? Our next meeting is Monday, right? And I have it set for again 6 in the morning.
Yeah, I thought all of ours were 6 in the morning.
Yeah, I think they are now. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's noon for you, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And
Let
then
me
we
just make sure I have Monday. That's the 4th, right?
yeah. And then
Oh,
the next one, then we have the 7th. Is the 4th okay?
yeah.
Okay. And then we go to the 7th.
Okay, I have the wrong time for the 4th too, but the 7th is okay.
Okay.
All right, so I'm just going to change that so I don't get confused again.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so for Monday, do you want to try and get some of that what you were just talking done, and I'll try and look at that and see if I can tighten it up too, and then because I think that's pretty much going to be the conclusion of the paper. We got to get the living well piece. Although I guess we'll finish reading through, and then write the conclusion together.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. All right. Well, we may need to find some time to do a longer stint than if we're going to actually write some stuff.
Okay.
But let's see how we get in the next 2 sessions.
Cool.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Take care.
I'll talk to you soon. All right. Bye.
Bye.